my huge talking points are like be physically ready, because to me that's a huge part of staying safe on the job and like not hurting yourself, because maybe you want to do this job, but if you injure yourself because you're not actually physically prepared, then and you throw your back out or something or bust your knee, then that's going to affect your daily life. So that's a huge part, is just like being physically fit, doing everything you can, because fitness is protection in a way in our job. The same as like military. If you can be out there and it's not too hard for you, then you're going to succeed in ways that people who are physically unprepared won't.
Greetings, Mops and Mo's team. Welcome back. Another week with Drew and Alex. We're mixing things up a little bit. We're taking a step away from the kind of military discussions, and we have on Alex.
We're branching out to fire a little bit here, and specifically wildland fire. We have Katrina Mohr. She grew up in Boulder doing lots of trail running, cross-country skiing, all that good kind of stuff. Job-wise, you'll hear a little bit about it during our conversation, but worked in some restaurants doing like high school job kind of stuff. Had an internship with Alpinist magazine because she was trying to go into like the journalism route initially. For a while, she worked as a freelance contributor for Hang Gliding and Paragliding magazine, which sounds like the coolest thing ever. But it was not for her. It was not a long-term fit. She had spent some time doing volunteer structural firefighting, and at some point in her 20s, kind of felt like she was lacking direction, trying to figure out what she was doing with her life. And she had a couple friends who got her into wildland firefighting around 2013. And that's what you'll hear all of this conversation about, has been her journey in firefighting, and specifically her journey as not just a woman in firefighting, but a smaller woman in firefighting, which comes with lots of physical fitness challenges and things she's had to overcome.
Yeah, so she mentions this in the podcast, and we'll link in the show notes her website, but you'll very quickly realize that Katrina's 5 feet tall, which when you picture a wildland firefighter is probably not what you would expect, but undoubtedly, as you listen to her talk, you will realize that she is an absolute badass. If you follow her on any of her socials, you'll see all the work that she's doing in the wildland firefighting world. But definitely one of our more unique guests, one of our cooler guests. No offense to everybody else we've had on, but a very interesting perspective on arguably one of the more physically demanding professions you could choose to go after.
And I'll say it was a pretty fun adventure getting her to come on the podcast. She did a podcast episode with Outside Online that Drew stumbled upon, and he brought up the idea of bringing her on to chat about the fitness component of it. And so I reached out to her, and I'm sure she was getting flooded with stuff because Outside's pretty big and people were finding it and sending her messages and stuff. But I invited her on the podcast. She got back to me a couple of days later, and she did her homework. She listened to a few of our episodes to figure out what we were all about. And her initial response was she didn't feel qualified to come on the podcast because she didn't know enough about fitness, and her own approach to fitness was not as structured as you might expect for like the strength and conditioning world. She's just kind of really into physical hobbies and things that keep her outside a lot. But there's some really practical, valuable lessons learned in there about like the kind of lifestyle that prepares you for really physical work.
Yeah, and I will read directly from the Outside headline. I'll actually steal it from them. Katrina Mohr she can handle the heat. At 5 feet tall, she was the smallest wildland firefighter in her crew and worried she couldn't keep up. But on her very first blaze, she discovered her strength. Enjoy. You're from Colorado, right?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Boulder, Colorado.
How cool was that?
I'm jealous.
It was great, but it's so different. It's hard to explain like Boulder then in the 80s to like now. I mean, my dad moved there in the 70s, and like his stories are even more
That
wild.
must
But
have
yeah,
been
there's
insane.
for sure. It was a great place to grow up because of the outdoor access, but the town itself is like wildly different than it is now.
So I want to ask you, this isn't necessarily diving off the deep end, but one of the things that we've talked about it a couple of times, but it certainly comes up in this industry, with strength and conditioning folks, but even in the tactical space, because a lot of people that work in this arena, I guess, are getting into it for like the first time. So imposter syndrome comes up a lot. And I could tell from, correct me if I'm wrong, but I could tell from some of your writing and some of the stuff that you mentioned in your interview and just kind of your story, like I can imagine being female, 5 feet tall, completely inexperienced with, fighting fire in the wilderness. Is that something that you struggled with when you were kind of getting started, or even now as you're going?
I would say even now, I do struggle with that, and definitely struggled with it coming up, especially being older. Sometimes it's hard. I was older than people, telling them what to do. They had already been in fire longer than I had. That's like when you're doing your training, especially firefighter 1, that's like your next step after entry level, and definitely doubted myself a lot and felt like I had to either over explain my qualifications or why I deserve to be there, or also just running into people on the fire line. They didn't, if ever I was with another crew member, most likely like 99 out of 100 times would be a guy who's larger than me, or just a guy. And they would always look past me to him, even if I was the one they were supposed to tie in with as like a squad boss or the engine boss. And so sometimes, even though a lot of the guys were really good about it, one guy, like there was one instance where the guy kept looking at him and he's like, "I'm not who you're supposed to be talking to. Like, look at her," and walked away. And I think that was like, kind of like, it made me feel happy just that crew member also realized it and just kind of like put a kibosh on that and was like, "Nope, I'm not letting this situation perpetuate." But it is frustrating then to have people either, like, you can see like sometimes like a flicker of annoyance, or especially if they're kind of like an older, saltier guy, like they don't think I have what they want, or like I'm not going to have the information that they need, or like I'm not going to be good at my job. So it definitely gets under your skin, I think, after a while, and just starts to kind of erode. I just dread sometimes those situations where I'd have to like go talk to someone. And then I think after a point, I just kind of like got over it, because I'm like, after I felt like there was a pattern where then I'd either over explain myself, and then I'd feel like I'd further erode my just my status in their eyes. And so then I just stopped explaining myself and just did my job. And I feel like that worked out better for me, just to like just show up and just act the way that I feel like I was noticing my other similar people in my experience level doing. So I just kind of adopted like, I don't need to explain myself to you. I'm just here doing my job. And I think that worked better for me ultimately. And there's definitely moments I still doubt myself, but I don't know. I'm a professional, and I feel like sometimes I just have to mantra myself of like, I'm a professional. I know what I'm doing. It's going to be okay.
You've been doing this now for how many years?
This is my 12th year.
Did you expect and I know Alex has like a follow-up, but just really quick, when you started, did you expect to be doing this for as long as you have?
No, definitely not. I mean, no, I feel like if any firefighter, if you ask that, they're like, "Oh yeah, I was just going to try it out for a few seasons." And then like, now I wake up 12 years later and I'm still, people are lying if they said they got into it. Like, I don't know, maybe there's like a few people that knew that this is what they were born to do. This is what they wanted. Yeah, I definitely didn't think that. I came from I went to school for magazine journalism. So coming out of school, I had like an amazing internship at Alpinist magazine in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and just like loved the people I worked with, loved what I was writing about, because I was really into climbing at the time and just like that kind of lifestyle. And then I'd never had a desk job before. I like grew up in all my after school jobs and stuff like that was in restaurants, either cooking or like serving and hostessing. And then my dad had a flagging business, or a traffic control business. So I was like a flagger, and like all my jobs were outdoors standing. And then that was my first desk job I ever had. And it just kind of like blew my mind, where I'm like, oh, I can't just sit here and like read about climbing and write about climbing. And then I get off work and it's dark out, and I'm trying to like squeeze in any activity, and it's an unpaid internship. So I have to work after hours. So it was really like a good real world eye opener, I guess. So that's like a long story to say. Yeah, I thought I would do fire for a little bit and just like make a little bit of money and give myself a cushion to like kind of get back into the freelance game that I had started after my alpinist gig. And then it just quickly became like, nope, that's not sustainable. That's not like a career I'm going to be able to get back into. So that's kind of why I started my blog, is just to like keep writing and like keep myself in that mode a little bit. But as far as fire, yeah, it was definitely my like, okay, I'm going to save some money and then like get back into it. And that never happened. So you're right.
So speaking of deserving to be somewhere, this is going to go back to our conversation about getting you on this podcast, but I thought it was pretty funny. You scoped out some previous episodes and were like wondering whether it was like appropriate for you to be on it because you weren't qualified on the topic or whatever, things like that. And I think that's like hilariously fitting for a conversation about imposter syndrome. But we're about to dive into like a little bit of your fitness history and how you approach it and all this kind of stuff. But one thing I wanted to say that might help a little bit is that like a week or two ago, I went back and looked at the download data for our last couple dozen episodes or something. And I was surprised to find that consistently, like without any variation, the most downloaded episodes were the ones where we did not even have a guest, which is somewhat shocking to me because some of the guests we brought on recently, I think are incredible and they're awesome and they're super qualified and they have these really interesting backgrounds and are way more qualified than Drew or I and all this stuff. But it turns out what people are looking for is like practical, actionable stuff, because that's the kind of thing we focus on when there's no guest. It's just like, how do you do this day to day? And I think that's where we're going to find some really cool value here. So it's not like you don't have like a background in formal strength and conditioning or anything, but you do have a background in things that made you successful in a physically demanding career. And I think that's the kind of stuff that people need and want to hear about. So I'm excited about it.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you touched on that because definitely when you guys approach me, I'm never going to just say yes to something without looking into it. Because I was like, oh, I want to check these guys out. And I'm not, wouldn't call myself like a fitness person in a way.
Will you stop? You are a 5 foot tall Wildland firefighter who has become like semi-famous and an absolute badass.
Well, I appreciate that. But it is funny to like, I was telling my husband even like, hey, I was approached by this podcast. Like I learned a lot just listening to the podcast and then asking me to be on it. And I just felt it's like mildly hilarious for me to come on. And my advice is basically just like, yeah, just like go outside and like do things.
Well, okay, let me here. I'm going to stop you because you're out of your mind. You were ultra endurance, right? Not just endurance, kind of longer distance stuff, right? Getting started.
Yeah, I guess I was into a lot of, it's not like I have race stats to prove it, but I was living and working in Yosemite National Park in the summers. And so I was the baker for Curry Village and just got super into like exploring all the trails, just like hike running and doing like 20 mile, 30 mile like days just to like be able to maximize my time off. So I guess, yeah, just wandering around.
How did that, I think the answer is probably an obvious one, but just to touch on this first, like how did that background, do you think how do you think that background helped with getting into the kind of physical, pipeline for becoming a firefighter?
I think it definitely helped. I don't know if you've ever gone for a long run, hike, or especially a trail where this is like pre-Avenza. So you're just like, I just had like a running backpack and like a trail map of Yosemite National Park, and you're just kind of figuring it out as you go. And sometimes trails signs fall down and you have to like compass it out and figure it out. So I think part of that is that sometimes you don't know if you're in the right area or you don't know when you're going to be done because you'll epic and maybe take a wrong offshoot and then your run hike will become a lot longer than you thought it would be, or conditions will be bad because you're not smart in the ways of the world yet, and you go up a south-facing aspect and then you come down the north-facing and there's thigh-deep snow and you have to get back to your car through the thigh-deep snow. So definitely some misadventures, I would say, where I just had to like accept my circumstances and like get out of it.
Everything you just said is stuff that I had no clue you had to take into account. So, okay, +1 for you. Okay, and I realize that we're looking kind of 12 years back now, but as you were kind of prepping for this,
yes,
if you were able to do it all over again, do you think you would have done, or would you have done anything differently leading into kind of the whole selection assessment process?
Oh, as far as getting into fire and like my stuff, I wish I had maybe thought, or I guess it's one of those where it's like, this might be tangential, but I wish I had set myself up for success more and just tried to correct imbalances because of digging line and just the way you carry saws and things like that. I feel like I've worked one side of my body like way more than the other. And I wish I had like thought about those kind of things because I've definitely had some injuries from that throughout my fire career that I've now had to correct. So I maybe wish I would have talked to some firefighters more about like, not just, oh, you have to hike and run and like do a lot of push-ups and pull-ups and stuff. Like you need to think about how you're using your body like day after day and making sure you're not just making one side increasingly weaker and the other side just overuse. Basically, my arm is like useless to my body always. Like I can anyway, so that's a problem I've always had. Just always right hand dominated.
Is that something you adjust for like on the job by deliberately using like offhand kind of stuff? Or is that something you adjust for in training? Because I was thinking about it, like some of your key tasks are like chainsawing and shoveling, which are like inherently asymmetrical tasks that are like it's tough. I don't know if anybody's like practiced shoveling backwards of what comes naturally. It doesn't feel good, and it takes time to adjust to.
Your body is like rebels against it. So then it just becomes easier to reinforce like just doing it on one side and creating those horrendous imbalances. So I guess the answer is yes to both. Definitely trying to like force myself when I have time where it's not like do or die, like, oh, we have to put this in fast. Like I try and work on my less dominant side and try and like work on those imbalances. And then also in training, after I had a shoulder injury 2 years ago, like actually going to physical therapy and like getting some professional help was obviously immensely helpful to go to a professional and like get some good exercises. So now in the preseason, this last 2 years, I've been pretty devoted to working on those so that I don't increase my injuries that I have, lingering things, and then just trying to strengthen offsides for sure.
Well, I promise we won't grill you about your training regime the whole time, but I do have a question that I was thinking about, again, reading some of your stuff. Once you got into this profession, did your training change at all in the sense of like, okay, now I have this gig, now this is my role, I need to train for this specifically? Or do you think that you just kind of naturally fell into it with all the things you were doing on the job? Let me give you some context. Let me give you some context for that. The reason I asked that question is because with the tactical population that we kind of work with, there is some of that conversation around, you know, you train to become selected for whatever. And then when you're there, you have to change your training because it needs to be mission specific, blah, 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 blah. And people fall into kind of different camps as far as how deep they go down that rabbit hole. So I'm just curious about the wildland firefighting community. Is there as much dialogue around like, I'll use the term sport specificity, but essentially, you know, specificity for the job, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So obviously we hike a lot with weight. So I would say that's one aspect of my training I don't skimp on. But then as far as like running, I'll kind of like, now that I know what it entails and kind of like I have kind of like a ramp up, ramp down phase that I've kind of followed the past few years after I knew kind of what I was getting into in that. But I guess before I knew what I was doing, I read about someone who like literally just pounded on a tire with a sledgehammer to reenact as close as possible to digging line. And I remember doing that like one day at the gym and was just like, this is stupid. I'm just going to like accept that I'm not going to be very strong at digging line. So I would say, yes, I've tried a little bit. And then I was just kind of picked and choose what I feel like was the most important to be in shape for when I started my job.
Well, I think that's an interesting point though, because like, again, this kind of goes into some of the tactical, but it's like people try to replicate the job incredibly, you know, oh, I do this motion over and over again. Let me do this in the gym. And you talked about imbalances and, you know, right versus left. It's like, if you're digging a specific way for, I would imagine, hours and hours and hours, and then you just replicate that in the gym with a sledgehammer and a tire, you're probably at some point, there's probably negative implications of that versus positive. I would imagine you want to mix things up, maybe.
Yeah, I would say so, especially now. This is something we talk about a lot in wildland firefighting, but when I started 12 years ago, we had more of a specific fire season where it was like, oh, you started in June and like maybe worked in October if there was like fuels money, but there wasn't necessarily like huge wildfires still happening. And now it's pretty much, we call it like a fire year. Like it's the creep is huge in the spring and the winter. Even like dead of winter now, like Colorado had like their most destructive wildfire ever 2 Decembers ago. And it's just, so I guess, yes, that definitely, I think about that now, or if I were to do that kind of stuff in February, I would be completely burned out. And I just feel like it's not worth it anymore. I have to reframed. It used to be like a marathon and now it's like an ultra marathon for a season. If that makes sense.
Well, I was not reading it to prepare for this episode, but it's weirdly relevant. I was reading a bunch of research about like what gets people to stick to fitness programs, because a significant majority of people who are like new gym members or new to a program do not stick with it for even more than a few weeks. And other than personality traits, which you can't really control that much, the things that make people likely to stick with it are most significantly having a plan, social support, and enjoyment. And I think in this conversation, you've gotten after a lot the point that like if you enjoy the training you do, you're going to do a lot more of it. And like a lot of an imperfect program is probably better than barely any of a perfect program. And I think there's something to be said for like our first conversation. You talked about how you basically just like ski and trail run and like get outside a lot. And whether or not that's perfect for wildland firefighting, I think it's clearly relevant in plenty of ways, and you enjoy it, so you do a bunch of it, and that's the whole point. Like if you don't enjoy hitting a tire with a sledgehammer, you're probably not going to do a lot of hitting a tire with a sledgehammer. So,
I mean, the people who just make themselves do things like that, but I guess I'm not. That's not my personality. And I remember you talking about on a previous episode, if there's a dog involved, like 1,000% gonna enjoy it. So having a dog who is able to go with me on like super long cross country skis or like backcountry skiing is, I think, was a huge part of it. It's like they're just staring me in the face when it's snowing outside and maybe it's blowing, but I'm like, I don't want to go. But then they're just there like, excuse me, like, to go outside now. You just have to go, and then you're glad once you go.
So I want to ask, this is kind of a behind the scenes question, because I know tactical human performance has kind of become a hot thing, no pun intended. And sort of, I guess, tangentially to that would be law enforcement, firefighter, but mostly structural. And I think when people think law enforcement, it's your standard, SWAT team or whatever. Wildland firefighting is kind of this weird, mysterious offshoot of that collection of things. Like everybody knows about the people in yellow. And if you've really read into it, you might know about smoke jumpers, and you've maybe seen the movie, about wildland firefighting. But specific to kind of your guys' day to day and training for what is clearly a very physical job, clearly a very important job. You mentioned that all the crews that you've been on have time for physical training. What does that look like? I mean, is there structure to that, or is everyone just kind of left to their own devices, or do you guys find stuff online, or what does that look like?
So each crew is different. I will say I'll speak most recently into the crew I'm on. So I'm on an engine module, so that's like 8 people. And so definitely at the beginning of the season, we want to, I'm the assistant on the engine and my captain, like we want to see where the seasonals are at. Like we want to make sure that if we have to go out and work, like everyone's kind of at a similar level, or at least to know who might be the slowest, who might be the fastest and need a little bit more exercise, that kind of thing. So definitely at the beginning of the year, we all train together. We definitely focus on hiking. The other day we did like a 5-mile hike with our packs, just to kind of, also people are new, just dialing in their packs, making sure they're comfortable and that like they fit them well. And then just doing lots of running and kind of, I don't know, lack of a better word, like calisthenics. So we do weights like kettlebells and dumbbells mixed into like body weight exercises. So that's kind of been our jam lately the past few weeks, is just kind of keeping everyone together, working hard as a crew, because that helps build the team too, of course, just like working together, working hard and like putting your all in. And then kind of how that looks in the day-to-day is that we do that in the morning. So that's the first thing we do, because then usually fires happen in the afternoon. So then we can make sure we get that time in. So that's pretty common schedule. But then in the off season or shoulder seasons, when it's just us perms that's permanent employees of the engine, are there in like February or March or like getting into November, then we just do it on our own, because then we've seen each other enough. We're kind of like sick of each other sometimes. And that's our time to either like work on what we want to, or just have our alone time and just go rage on the Stairmaster with like a weight vest or something and like watch a movie. I don't know. It's kind of our own time.
I didn't even think about that, because you guys, I mean, you mentioned seasonals. I'm going to use your words, seasonals and perms. Yeah. So there's seasonal folks that come in. Is it the same kind of, is it the same people every year, or are you dealing with a new batch of people every year?
New people, at least like 1 or 2. So our engine is really lucky in that generally we have people stay for 2 or 3 years. So we kind of have a stagger of like, they're not like all starting at the same time and then leave after 3 years. We have kind of a stagger. So we generally have similar faces, and then all 3 of us perms, 3 out of 4. We've worked on the engine together since 2019. So we have like a pretty good relationship going with that. And then we have a new perm who started last year, who returned this year, and then 2, then we had other seasonals that have like returned. So obviously we're more of like, engines are more mentoring. Like we kind of, people start there and then they don't stay forever, and maybe they'll come back to it later in their career, but it's good to train people up and then have high standards for them, and they get to learn that from us, and then they'll go to other crews. Like we have multiple people who are on our engine who are now on shot crews, and people who ultimately want to be smoke jumpers or just like other places on the forest. Like we have a repeller base. So we have some alumni from our engine who are now recent repellers. So I don't know. It's just cool to see people go and do other things. But yes, so to answer your question, like definitely new people every year. So it's a lot of training, like new people, and just getting them set up with our standards, and just also just what we're trying to teach them for wildland fire as a person.
And do they, I mean, this is like incredibly interesting to me, but there's no national, like, hey, you gotta, or is there, like, when they show up, is it just your crew that's determining, hey, you're fit enough to do the thing? Or do they have to go through some sort of gateway to say, hey, like, yeah, I can do the bare minimum, and then let's kind of tailor what they have to do based on what we know that our crew needs to accomplish?
No, that's a good question. So all wildland firefighters nationally, they have to pass a pack test. So that's 45 pounds, 3 miles on pretty much flat terrain, and they have to do it in under 45 minutes. If you're like at super high elevation, they'll add in like 30 seconds here or there. But
you can't run, right? You can't run.
No, you can't run. You're supposed to have 3, I don't know, a foot on the ground at all times. So you're not
supposed
the
speed walking shuffle thing from the Olympics.
Just like the most annoying mall walk, like speed walk. You can imagine. So that's like the absolute bare minimum. And then we also have the BLM fitness test. And so that's, it's like a grading system. So they just recently, I don't know exactly, but in the last 2 or 3 years, they like put a female category. It used to be like all firefighters had this like grading system, and now they have different ranking point system for females also. But that includes, push-ups, sit-ups, a 1.5 mile run, and then there's like a flexed arm hang, or also a plank. So there's like a few variations, but those are the core exercises that go along with that. And so
no leg tuck, Alex.
They got pull-ups. They got the flex arm hang slash pull-ups, so I'll take it.
No leg tuck, but that'd be a good addition. So that's another thing that a lot of people will do at the beginning of the season. Another crew I was on, we did that like beginning of the season, middle of the season, end of the season, just for people to kind of get a gauge on how they improved, and like just, I don't know. It's also kind of fun just to like have a day. Like last year we did it for fun. It was like pouring rain. We're like on the high school track, like doing our 1.5 miles, and then did all our push-ups and sit-ups and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's good team building as well, just to like try really hard and see what you get, and then add up your points. So some people get perfect scores, and that's like a big to do for them if that's what they're
So I'm going to ask you to back up for a second and define some terms for the audience, because you talked about the pack test, which
we got seasonals and perms.
Yeah, we're gonna get all sorts of vocab in this episode.
Yeah, it's a lot of, as you know, as government.
That's but that first one you talked about is the arduous work capacity test, which is for the audience, just to specify it, 45 pounds, 3 miles, max of 45 minutes, and like
no running.
Said, no running.
No,
which I think is fascinating, because there's a whole conversation in the Army about ruck running, and like the test everybody ends up having to do is the 12-mile test, which is like a lot, and depending on how tall you are, like needing to run becomes a thing sometimes, all sorts of stuff. But
yeah, it's with shorter legs. It's hard to keep up on flat terrain with tall people.
But when I was looking into wildland stuff, I found the hotshot standards that are on your blog. But before we go over those, I was going to ask, can you talk real briefly? You mentioned the different kinds of crews, like engine, hotshot, smoke jumper. Can you just like explain what those are real quick for people who don't know anything about wildland?
So basically, there's a lot of ways to be a wildland firefighter, I guess is the best way. So that's kind of the umbrella term, and that can include engine crews. So those are this is very general. I don't want to get into every single typing, but that can be like type 6s, and that's like a usually pickup truck and they have 300 gallons of water. And then I'm on type 4, and that's like a CDL type, like semi truck front that carries 800 gallons of water. You need a CDL to drive that. And then there's heli-tac crews. So that'll be a helicopter with a crew attached so they can like land just random places in the wilderness or just inaccessible areas and just dump a crew out. And then there's heli-repellers. And so they take it a step further and they hover, the helicopter will hover, and then they will rappel down a fixed line to the ground. And then there's smoke jumpers who will take it even a step further and they'll jump out of the plane with a parachute. And then they land in super inaccessible terrain to fight fire. And then that doesn't even include like there's fuels positions. Those are people who do prescribed fire. You can be in dispatch. Those are the people who we rely on to give us information and take our information and do things behind the scenes. And then that's all the way up to like leadership, like overhead, like FMOs, which is like a fire management officer. And they're kind of like the bosses. And then there's all sorts of different ones. But that's like a basic gist of like our structure and like the different firefighting options, like what firefighters can look like.
Well, and then you got that big old airplane that can fly over and dump a ton of. I follow them on Instagram, and that thing is so cool.
Oh yeah, I didn't even talk about aviation. They're super important too. So not even like heli-tac crews, but just like literal pilots who are like flying around being air attacked. So they're like orchestrating, making sure all the aircraft in the air don't fly into each other. And then there's helicopters of multiple different types, like type 3s, which are smaller, all the way up to type 1s, which are like giant Chinooks, and like type 2s are Blackhawks. And they're delivering water, retardant. And then there's planes, so like single engine air tankers called seats, and they'll drop retardant. And they're more of like, just a smaller dual propeller plane, up to like, we call them very creatively VLATs, very large air tankers. And they're like the C-130s that are dropping like immense. Those are the ones that you see a lot on the news because they're like big and showy, just like dropping huge amounts of retardant and water and stuff onto fires. So forgot about all of the aviation. Very important also.
Shout out aviation community.
Yeah.
So I had like a surprising weird run-in with wildland firefighting 2 years ago. I sent Drew some videos because
Alex did a gender reveal and set a forest on fire.
I promise I did not start the fire, but
You're shooting up.
I promise. But it was during my terminal leave. I had just left active duty and I was like taking a few months to just like go all over and hike. I went to Alaska and hiked. I went to Colorado and hiked. I was in California hiking, and I was climbing Mount Tamalpais, and I was like right at the summit, which I did not know had like a radar station up there or something. So I'm like coming around this radar station thing, and I see a little bit of smoke on the horizon, and like that's a concerning thing.
You know what they say, Alex? Where there's smoke, there's fire.
And it like the speed with which, so this was like relatively road accessible because of the radar station. You can get trucks in pretty well, but from like me first seeing any smoke at all to there being like 3 engines, 2 helicopters, 2 fixed wing aircraft, and like a line of dudes just like marching down the hill to get there, had to have been like 5 minutes, maybe 10. I was astonished, but it was super cool because like I sent you the video, but like one of the planes flew over and like dropped retardant like basically right over my head, and then like a helicopter lands next to the radar
At that
station.
point, you're a liability. You're in the way.
I mean, I probably was a tiny bit of a liability, but I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. But
no, that's a pretty epic response. There, different places will have different run cards where it's like, okay, if any tone out happens, like any smoke is like found, like they're sending this many resources like in this way. I had just gone up there because it's like right near the Golden Gate Bridge and stuff, and I like hiked down to Muir Woods and all that stuff that day. But I can imagine the consequences if like any part of Marin County burned would be like nightmare levels of damage. And like, I can't.
Well, I think so. This brings up an interesting point that we didn't even talk about, Alex, before we started taking notes. I mean, like, one of the things we hear about in the military community all the time is like, oh, you got to be constantly ready because like war could kick off tomorrow. And like, okay, cool, it could, like, in fairness. But for you guys, like, even when we were trying to schedule this podcast, you're like, I could get called out, at any point. Have you? I mean, I have all kinds of questions along that line of thought, but have there been real world experiences for you where you have seen situations where like people aren't fit enough to do the thing because they haven't been able to maintain like what is essentially a constant state of fitness year round in some cases?
Yeah, and I guess I wouldn't say necessarily year round because Idaho, we get a ton of snow in the winter, so it's different than like the Front Range of Colorado where I lived, where like those kind of fires are happening, and that's like an absolute possibility of like any time of the year. But yeah, I wouldn't say on our crew, but there's definitely been other crews you work with where you're either passing people and like it's a kind of do or die situation where like we need to get to this, like same as you were talking about with like you just saw the smoke and it's like high consequence if that fire gets out of control. And it's hard to see sometimes because I feel like I don't know, you want to take pride in your work and like be a professional. And to me, that's like if you're barely meeting the standards, if you're like barely can pass the pack test, which is like objectively a pretty easy test, it's hard to see sometimes people who are not really meeting or like barely meeting those like absolute bare minimums and aren't really, you can tell like on the fire line, you're like, ooh, this is someone to watch. Like I'm an EMT and then I've been part of several medicals where it's like people are just drinking Mountain Dew and just like go down and it just makes it a liability because like then we have to get them out of that situation. And it's hard to see sometimes and not get frustrated about like, why aren't people taking care of themselves? Like that's first thing is you have to take care of yourselves before you can like be a good part of the team and then to the overall team of the fire for sure.
Is there, and again, just out of curiosity, you mentioned a lot of these situations, like you have to go out for, 7 days, 14 days, kind of an indeterminate amount of time. Has there been I don't know, an influx of a more modern viewpoint on, fueling, sleep, physiology as it pertains to that type of thing? Or is it still kind of this situation where we see sometimes in the military where it's like, I'm fueling on Monster and dip, and that's just how I'm going to get through, XYZ. Is it the same for you guys, or have you seen an injection of like, hey, maybe we should be a little bit more intelligent when it comes to these sustained missions?
I think definitely just with the internet too, or like Instagram, I think people have more access if they're like wanting to dive down rabbit holes of nutrition or just like proper fueling, they can do so. But I do feel like the Forest Service as a whole, or at least like on my forest, 2 years ago, we have something called like Zone Week, where then like we just basically every resource on the zone will come together and then we go to presentations and just kind of do training as a group. And then 3 years ago, they had a nutritionist come in and like talk to us. And I thought that was really cool because I don't know, I learned a lot of things too that maybe I had like been doing intuitively, but it's nice to know the science behind it or understand like why it worked. So I like really appreciated that. And then I do think because there have been issues where, yeah, people have just been like living on Mountain Dew and Monster and Red Bull and Red Line that was around for a while. And then just like, and just have gone down and like really affected fire operations or just like caused other issues on crews where I think they've been trying to do, or people have gotten rhabdo. Like that's been a thing too, where people are like on fires just having their muscles eating themselves, and that's not good. So I do think the Forest Service as a whole, or maybe just federally firefighting resources like BLM and beyond, because we're not the only firefighting resources, they've done a better job of trying to like, even if it's just a dumb flyer, like we still cover it, and maybe someone like wouldn't pipe up and be like, oh, I learned something, maybe I should drink water, but at least they're like getting the information out and trying to tell people that. I don't know. That's
well, I guess the reason I asked that question is because, and I could be so wrong here, but having lived out west for a while, you kind of hear about how, wildland firefighting, every time there's a massive fire, everyone talks about how important it is, et cetera, et cetera. But I think as with any kind of, federal gig, it's pretty underfunded. You guys are generally hurting for resources. And I've always just envisioned it as kind of being every team for themselves, every engine for themselves, like figure it out. And I'm probably wildly off there, but you certainly don't hear about, oh, we're embedding, dietitians in the wildland firefighter service, or we've got strength coach positions and opening up for the wild. Like you just don't hear about that kind of thing. Yet you guys are being asked to do incredibly arduous stuff. And I don't even know if there's resources like that for you guys, or if you're literally just winging it.
I think it depends. This is where it gets in the weeds a little bit. It depends on the fire. So with like larger campaign fires, like type 1, type 2, where there's a huge management team that'll come in with like a huge camp with semi-trailers and like an actual catering staff, they're in their contract, they have to give lunch at like 3 meals a day that meet a certain calorie requirement. And that used to just be like any calories. So it could have just been empty calories or in like a ton of sugar. Cause obviously that's a great way to give people calories, is like a bunch of Snickers bars or, you know what I mean? Stuff like that. And like a bag with like 3 cherry tomatoes in it was like your vegetable. And so I think there was a lot of pushback because it was those kind of meals or MREs. I mean, you guys are well acquainted, you know what great, like fun meals those are to consume, like 3 meals a day for 14 days on end. So I think there was a lot of pushback where people were just like, this is unacceptable. Like, we can't really do our job with all these like sugar highs and lows. Like, this is not great fuel for us. So I do feel like a lot of the catering contracts have gotten better for larger fires. And then my favorite is like when we're in like smaller towns and they get catered by like a local restaurant, and you'll get like, sometimes in Wyoming, you'd have like the best steak and like potatoes and like, I don't know, broccoli and stuff like that of your life, just because it's like cattle country. So sometimes it can be really good, and you get like a really good meal that's well balanced and like feels like it's filling you up. And then other times I've been on fires where it seems like an afterthought, and you're like stuck on the hill, and they'll fly you in a box of MREs and then like sugary breakfast cereal and like a gallon of milk. And like, you're like, that's not adequate. And like some orange juice. And it just seems really bad. But there's definitely ways now where we can report that and just say like, hey, this is not meeting our standards, like anyone's standards, really. Like, that's not acceptable. Or this showed up and like it wasn't refrigerated properly and people are getting sick. So there's just, I think, easier ways to bring that up the chain and just get better. But would not say it's perfect. It's still like not very well standardized, and it does depend. But I do feel like freeze-dried meals have gotten a lot better. So that's something on our engine. And then my forest in general, that we have access to food boxes. So that's going to sustain you for 48 hours for like our crew. And it has like real food in it and not just MREs. So I don't know, supplementing has become like more normal, and it's become more acceptable to eat like freeze-dried meals and not feel like you have to like tough it out and like be a firefighter and eat your MREs, or like you're being a wuss or something. So I don't know, things are getting better, but not at a great pace.
So we just covered the nutrition, like how that supports performance and things like that. And I was looking at some of the stuff on your blog, and you talked about like going through a 14-day roll with like 16 to 24-hour work days, like ridiculous night shift kind of stuff. Like that all sounds to me like a ton of sleep disruption. And even when you can sleep, I imagine the conditions for sleep are not particularly great. Is there discussion in terms of like sleep strategies and fatigue mitigation stuff? Is that something that's thought about, or is it the same kind of tough it out situation you talked about?
Same thing. I think that's getting better. When I started, it was like pretty normal to work till like 2 a.m. and then they'd be like, oh yeah, just like go bed down and like come back on 8 hours later. And you're like, oh great. So I'm going to try and sleep after I'm all keyed up from like being out on the fire line, like in dangerous situations, like with my headlamp on. And now I'm expected to try and sleep. And then it's going to, within that 8 hours, then the sun's going to come up and it's going to get hot in my tent. So yeah, I think they've realized like that's not very good. And there's definitely been some fatal driving accidents because they've pushed people. And then they're like, oh yeah, you have to drive like an hour to camp to actually go to sleep. So that kind of stuff has happened where I think it's made people realize that's not sustainable. So some things they've been better about is if you've worked a night shift and then you need to reset to we call it our 2-to-1. So you work basically for every 2 parts, you get 1 part rest. So like 16-hour work day and then 8 hours of rest. So now they're more okay to get people a hotel room so you can actually be in like a quiet, dark place and like sleep. Or like they'll rent out high school gyms or other places where it can be like actually dark and quiet and not just expect you to like try and sleep in a lawn in the full sun, like in the full daylight to get your rest if you're on night shifts. And even sleep trailers, which are not my favorite because they feel like a COVID / like any other kind of respiratory nightmare where you're like packed into like a semi trailer with like 3 bunk beds on each side and just like in rows. It's crazy.
Well, you mentioned you don't even like tents. You like sleeping under the stars, right?
Yeah, mostly because I'm lazy and I like to squeeze every last bit of sleep. I call it my cowboy roll. I just have my air mattress that I just, in my sleeping bag on top, I'll just throw that out. And that's like what I sleep on most of the time. But yeah, I guess to answer your question, it is getting better, and they've definitely been mitigating sleep more and realizing like that's super important and giving people better places and better like environments to get quality rest. So that's been a nice change for sure.
That's good to hear. I do have one last one on like the explicitly physical fitness stuff, and then I will probably just kind of like riff on some other relevant topics that
No, we'll
aren't
probably
as.
come back. We always come back to the
That's
fitness
true.
stuff. We will. We'll get there.
But I was digging through. I was like, we talked about the baseline hike test, and I was curious about like higher standards for other things you can do and stuff. And I found on your page the U.S. Hot Shots Association standards. Um, First, for the audience, it's a 1.5 mile run in 10:35 or less. It's 25 push-ups in a minute, 40 sit-ups in a minute, and chin-ups on a really interesting weight scale where if you weigh 170 and up, you only have to do 4, and then like lower weights below 170, like 135 to 169 is 5, 110 to 134 is 6, 109 is 7. I thought that was interesting. I'd never seen like a weight scaled pull-up standard before. It's also the first time that I've ever been in the heavyweight category of something.
Hey, welcome. Welcome to the heavyweight category, Alex. Congratulations.
That feels kind of exciting for me.
Can you do 4 pull-ups?
I hope so.
All right.
But is that the only one of those where like a certain community has a certain fitness standard, or are there things like that in other places around Wildland?
And I feel like it's sometimes crew specific. So you fit to the culture of your crew. So some crews are big running crews, some crews are big hiking crews. But like that, as far as I understand, I've done details on hotshot crews, but I've never done like a full season. So as far as I understand, that's like what they strive for. And it may be like, but as far as I understand, like the condition of hire is truly only like the pack test as far as the standards. And then smoke jumpers have their own training thing, and like they have their own minimums, but they're more of like a closely guarded secret within like their community, because they don't like to talk about rookie training because they like to keep that their own thing. So I'm sure there's other like there's standards that they have like along those same veins, but probably just shorter like time frames and faster run for sure.
Wait, so hold on real quick for the pull-up thing. So you, as being 5 feet tall, you have to do, I mean, regardless of male, female, whatever, you have to do more pull-ups than the big, beefy, muscular guys. Yeah. That's interesting, because usually it's the other way around.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. And to be fair, I wrote that page of my blog probably like 4 years ago. So it could be different by now. But as far as I am aware, that's like still the standards.
I will say that test looks an awful lot like they just borrowed Army standards and like adjusted it appropriately. And
I'm sure they did. Yeah.
If you know people over in like whatever organization sets up these tests, just convince them to take the sit-ups out, because it doesn't make any sense. And we're finally doing that on our side. So like you guys should probably do it too. It doesn't like, really
like the new alternative, and that's like a better gauge. Like more people do, like, or in addition to sit-ups, they'll do plank for sure.
Is the fitness conversation around wildland firefighting, does it fluctuate with like big fires? And I guess the reason I asked that question is because we had a guy on not too long ago, Dr. East, talking about the history of physical culture in the military. And one thing that was incredibly obvious is that you have a big war, and then there's a lot of discussion about, oh man, we should really focus on people getting fit. And then it kind of fades away. Then you have another big war, and you have, with you guys, do you have like a massive fire, everything's going crazy, hey, we should really structure fitness, we should prioritize fit, and then it just kind of fades away and then it comes back? Or is it more of just a constant, because it's so constant, just kind of a constant thing you're after, if that makes any sense?
I think definitely federally, because obviously, I guess I didn't speak to, there is contract crews, and like, I don't want to say that all contract crews are not as good as federal, because that's not true. I've definitely worked with some really great contract crews who are in the private sector, and then some federal that maybe aren't up to the standards that we keep on our engine module. But I do feel like in the eyes of the government, like all of us are equal. And so someone out in the news who is maybe like on the low end of the spectrum in regards to fitness versus like, I don't know, a jumper who's like incredibly fit, and like it's hard sometimes to reconcile, like there isn't more of a standard other than the pack test. But I would not say that it's a thing internally, or like I feel like in the media of like firefighter fitness, I guess, that I've heard of. I think it's more just something that all of us firefighters like are aware of out on the line sometimes, where it's can be frustrating, but it's not like something, I guess, that I've ever honestly like talked about with anyone else of like, oh, there should be high. because we have such a retention problem already, that I think it would be really hard to then throw like, oh, you must meet the hotshot fitness standards for anyone to be on a crew. So,
well, I want to ask you, one of the things that stood out when I was reading kind of the transcript for your Outside Online feature, talking about people underestimating themselves, and you phrased it in an interesting way. You said that they should be curious about accomplishing things. And so I'm curious about how that curiosity has helped you, because oftentimes you hear that same line of thinking, but it's kind of wrapped up in this sort of macho, like just go out and crush stuff, and like, you know, Jocko and David Goggins and all this. But for you, it was more about curiosity, and that's what's led you to this fantastic career and really like a really cool experience. So what does that look like for you?
I guess maybe to me, curiosity is the softer side of like, just do it. Because it is kind of the same mental headspace you have to get in of just like, well, I'm going to just try this and like, we'll see what happens. Like you have to sometimes psych yourself up to do that. But I guess a lot of times the curiosity is like anyone, when you're trying to up your fitness standards, it's like when I was running and trail running, it'd be like, okay, so I did 16 miles. Like, what if I do 20? And you just like keep like kind of increasing it and maybe just do your own more personal bests. And so I think that's a huge part of just being willing. And part of it is just being willing to volunteer. Like going back to very beginning of what we were talking about, of feeling underestimated or feeling like imposter syndrome, is that a huge part of it is like, well, why can't I just volunteer for this? Like maybe I will fail, but I'll learn something. And so it's definitely wrapped up in that curiosity of like, I should just try, and like, it's okay. Sometimes the outcome is like, it doesn't matter. It's like low stakes, even if it feels super high stakes in your mind of like, should I volunteer for this? Or like, should I try this? Like people are going to look at me like either, I don't know, it's all those kind of emotions where you're like, oh, people are going to look at me like I'm stupid, or like I'm going to embarrass myself, or I'm not going to do this perfectly. And then just kind of like trying to let go of that and just being curious, I guess, is really the best way I can describe it. And just being like, just having well, I'll try and see what happens kind of attitude. And that's led me pretty well so far. So I'm going to keep going with that.
Well, I have kind of like a 2-part follow on for that. Do you think you had that within yourself prior to getting into this, and that's what led you to it? And then kind of part 2 to that question, now that you've been doing this for a long time, have you found places in your day-to-day life outside of firefighting where that same kind of mantra has led you into some interesting experiences?
I would say, let's see. I would say to the second part, one example I can think of is like, I'm a newer like skier, I guess. I didn't grow up skiing, even though I grew up in Colorado. My dad was a huge marathon runner. And so I think part of that is like my dad always drove me in ways like in sports, like not in a bad way, but he always just had like high expectations for just kind of like what I could accomplish. Like he always saw maybe more in me than I did, and he pushed me to try. And so it always felt really gratifying to like, I don't know, go run a race and just tell him my time, or go run a race and like, oh, I did this like really far cool trail or something. And I think that's a huge part of it, is like my upbringing of just like having high bars and trying to meet those, and then getting to have really cool experiences like that. So when I was working in Yosemite, my second season, my dad and I did the John Muir Trail together, which was like an amazing experience. And we did it like pretty fast. Like sometimes I'll tell people like we did 20-mile days, which is like pretty brutal on the John Muir Trail. It's a lot of elevation gain. Like pretty much every day we were doing 3,000 feet plus of elevation gain and loss. And that was just the time frame he could take time off work to do it. So we were like, well, I guess we're just going to do it this fast, or we're not going to do it. And we, of course, had all sorts of misadventures and like lots of memories, but that's just remains like a huge highlight of my time with my dad, just to be able to like do something so physical with him, because that was like such a huge part of growing up, is like going on runs together and doing that kind of thing. So that's part of it. And then I guess going back to the skiing, like I was definitely a newer skier, and then my husband is like an amazing tele skier, and he's really pushed me to like kind of go outside my bounds and like do harder things. And I'm still like this sounds funny, but like for being a wildland firefighter, I'm like a pretty cautious person. Like I'm not a big jumper off of things and like that kind of stuff. So I'm very conscious of like, if I do this, am I going to like hurt myself and not be able to work mentality for sure. But he's definitely helped me push my myself into the backcountry and like get to do some more really amazing experiences that I think would have been really scary for me. So that's been like a cool progression just personally I've been able to do of just like doing bigger objectives. And I'm learning to snowmobile. Like I'm also not a super mechanical person. So I think part of that is too my curiosity mindset is like last year, one of the guys on the engine who's like really mechanical wasn't with us. He was on a detail, and it was a lot of like YouTube university for me trying to like fix stuff on the engine. So but it's still running. So I don't know, just trying to be like, well, we'll figure it out. We got to, because otherwise we can't go fight fires. So I think that's part of it. I hope I answered your question.
That was perfect.
That I didn't quite speak to, but yeah.
That's awesome. So this is one I was thinking about. And again, it just kind of came up as I was reading some stuff on your blog, and it kind of connects to your John Muir Trail stuff and getting out the backcountry in general thing. And I don't know whether the mental health conversation is a big one in the firefighting community. It's definitely a big one in the military community. And something stood out about like in the times where you did not have any cell reception for the entire time you were out there, it's like multiple weeks with no cell reception. You had better conversations with your teammates, like more present in the moment and things like that. And I was wondering if you had kind of just any thoughts on that, really, because I think there's value. You clearly found some value in unplugging, and I don't have the evidence on this. I haven't read any of the research on it, but I'm confident that like the amount of connectivity we all have today is a huge part of the mental health stuff. But just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like it's hard to explain to younger generations of like I'm 37, so similar. It's just people your own age, you understand like we didn't have cell phones. Like I had a cell phone that could play like Snake and was like black and gray back in, like high school. You know what I mean? It's just so different to explain to people. Like I didn't grow up with the internet just being in your pocket and just being able to go out and get lost, like we talked about, with just literally a map. And like it wasn't by choice. It's like that's what you had. That's how you had to make your adventures work. And I do feel like it's just such a bummer sometimes to see people who were their whole entire lives, because I have like 2 19-year-olds on the crew this year. And I feel like they have a pretty healthy relationship with social media, but then you see other people their same age where they're constantly like glued to their phone and they just feel so helpless without it because they're just so used to following a blue dot around, and like they can't read a topo map, and they just seem so much farther behind like to get into the fire world and to be able to unplug. And they just have such a sense of anxiety, like when we're out and we don't have service and they can't like check in on their socials or like do things like that. I feel like I'm okay with doing because I'm used to it. I've lived that part of my life where I didn't have a phone and I didn't need to do that. And it is sad sometimes when we have fires out in the wilderness where previously you wouldn't have any service. Like there's definitely been times where I haven't had service for like at least 12 days, probably 2 weeks. And it's just you'll gather around the campfire at the end of the day and like eat your meal and just get to like joke about things that happened that day and just like have real conversations. Whereas if that happens and we have service, everyone's just like doing what they would normally, just in their own little bubble. Like, I mean, obviously it's important to call loved ones and have that, but when the possibility is removed, then you just have to accept it and like not just kind of like shut that part of yourself off of like, oh, I can't check in with my husband or my partner or whoever. But I do just feel like it's really detrimental to see people who just didn't get to live that. And then it makes me bummed out where now it's increasingly even more common to have inReaches and have like Starlinks on fires just for logistical reasons. And so it's like service has become pretty much common everywhere you go, even if it is the middle of the wilderness. So I am definitely grieving kind of that part of fires where you get to have this special time with each other and you're like not forced to interact, but it's like because you don't have phones, you do. And it's definitely like special conversations I wouldn't have had if everyone just was like, oh, let me make a quick call and then I'll come back to the fire and like chat. So yeah, I don't know. It is a bummer. And then going back to the mental health, like absolutely, I think fire parallels. I've never been in the military, but as far as like the same kind of 100 to 0, you'll go if you're out with your teammates and your crew fighting a fire, like completing a mission, and then all of a sudden it's the off season and you don't have that anymore. You don't have that support system. So definitely, I think there's been a lot more push for mental health and recognizing that and just offering people support without having to be super tough and macho about it. Like, it's okay to go to a therapist, or it's okay to like talk about really rough things you've seen, and like kind of be able to, I don't know, process those emotions and not just like suck it up and just carry on and carry that stuff inside anymore, for sure.
Well, I want to let you highlight your website, which I thought was phenomenally named, the 5footfirefighter.com. And because I was going to ask you if there was anything about the process that you wish you knew when you first were getting started, or if you think having what you kind of described in your outside online feature is like some naivety about it. But now what you do is basically assist other people in getting into this profession. So I guess I will ask you that, like, when you were first getting started, are there things you wish you knew, or do you think kind of not really having an idea of what you were getting into ended up being helpful? And then how do you now give back to other folks that are looking to get involved?
So I think I'm glad I still had a little support. I didn't go in completely blind, because I did have two friends who are hotshots who helped me like with the application process. Without them, there's no way I would have been able to navigate that. It was confusing then, and it's especially confusing now, which is kind of like why I have my website and my blog. So I feel like I'm glad I had some naivete, because honestly, at that point in my life, I don't think I would have, just going through that first season, I truly didn't think if I knew all the expectations that would have been placed on me, I think I would have bowed out and just didn't think I was strong enough or capable enough. So I'm kind of glad I was just forced into it and just like had to adopt that curiosity mindset that I had talked about. Because I think if someone would have sat me down and been like, these are the expectations, this is the weight you're going to have to carry, this is going to be your day to day, I think I would have just been like, nope, I don't think that's for me. Like, I really don't think I'm capable. And you just don't know until you try. So I think that is like a huge part of like what I try to preach to other people. Some of my emails that I get from newer firefighters are a lot of either smaller people or women who are just like, hey, I never saw myself in firefighting until I saw you, and now I know it's possible. And like, that gives me hope. And like, those are some of my absolute favorite emails to get. Or back when I was naming it, I almost wavered between like, do I name it after myself and try and like make it about me in a way, like with the 5 foot firefighter? Or I also like had a different name of just like Wildfire 101. And in a way, it's almost like I'm glad I named it this way, because I do feel like it keeps people who are just like in it for the macho. Honestly, like, they don't reach out to me. They're not curious about it. They don't click on it, and they don't like dive into my information. Whereas I've definitely gotten emails from men and women, and a lot of them, the guys were like, oh yeah, I didn't like click on yours until I maybe saw it somewhere else. And like, I don't know, it's kind of that same like who can be an expert situation, which is really funny. But I don't know, I just love those kind of emails and like that kind of feedback where people are like, you helped me get a job, or like this information helped me like get into this career. So that's kind of why I have the blog. Sometimes it's hard to with all the mental health and just like the demands of this job, with it becoming more of a fire year versus fire season. Sometimes I struggle with like, am I really helping people get into a great career, or like, am I luring people down a path of like, this is a cool job, and like the culture of the cool job is not always presenting all sides of like what it actually will mean to you and your relationships and like your daily life outside of the job. So that's something I struggle with for sure. But I try to paint a realist. So that's part of it, is like, I try and paint a realistic picture of like, yeah, there's a lot of highs and lows with this job for sure. And you have to accept that. But it's hard. Like, I don't want to scare people off either, because we do have like not as many applicants, and we really do need to get more firefighters, and it is a great job and I love it. So it's really hard, I guess, to answer your question a little more succinctly. It's like, I really do struggle with painting it as accurately as possible while helping people who want to get into it. And then also just kind of like catering to people who will go the extra mile and like trying to seek out information versus like, I don't know, it's still my time. Like, I spend a lot of my own time working on it. So I try and like, just, I don't know, honor myself in that way too, of just not trying to help every single person who has any whim of being a firefighter. I like feel like in a way, almost like naming it the 5 foot firefighter kind of like weeds out people who maybe only want to be a firefighter for like other reasons other than like they're genuinely interested in it, if that makes sense.
Totally.
That goes kind of all the way back to our conversation at the top about getting you on this podcast in the first place. I've been blown away in the last few things you said and several other things throughout the conversation about how closely some of the things you're reckoning with parallel with things that the military is dealing with. Like, you guys have a recruiting and retention issue. We have a recruiting and retention issue. And like, people in uniform like wonder about how to message it because you want to be honest about what the experience is. And some people, like, I say all the time that I got more out of the Army than I ever gave to the Army, but that's not true of everybody, right? Some people sacrifice in some really terrible ways, and it finding ways to like honestly message it in a way that both like acknowledges how cool parts of it are and that it is a cool career, while being honest about some of the challenges that come with it and the fact that it's not perfect and there are things you're going to run into that'll be tough. But I just think, I don't know, it was a really cool lens into it from the firefighting side of some really similar issues.
Yeah. How do you do it? Do you have any tips? Yeah. I wanna know.
Yeah, start a podcast to just talk about crazy things all the time. I want to ask you, I mean, we've taken up a ton of your time, and I mean, as far as I know, there could be a fire happening right now, and we're just like keeping you away from it. But you mentioned that you do. Maybe it's because of, well, now you're famous, but prior to, I mean, your website kind of alludes, the 5-foot firefighter. Like, I would imagine you get a lot of questions from women and a lot of questions from small people who maybe are also women who are looking to get into this type of work. And so, what do you kind of tell them? You mentioned being transparent and honest about what it entails. Like, what do you talk to those people about?
I guess my huge talking points are like, be physically ready. Because to me, that's a huge part of staying safe on the job and like not hurting yourself. Because maybe you want to do this job, but if you injure yourself because you're not actually physically prepared, then, and you throw your back out or something or bust your knee, then that's going to affect your daily life. So that's a huge part, is just like being physically fit, doing everything you can, because fitness is protection in a way in our job. The same as like military. If you can be out there and it's not too hard for you, then you're going to succeed in ways that people who are physically unprepared won't. And then definitely the curiosity mindset, where I'm just like, just volunteer. Like, don't worry about looking silly, especially for females. I think sometimes we're taught like you have to do it perfectly, otherwise you're failing. And I mean, I'm sure guys feel this way too. I don't want to like overly genderify it, but I do feel like that's sometimes a common thing I run into with women, where they're like, well, I'm scared I'm going to look dumb, or like, I'm not going to be good enough. And it's like, well, you don't know until you try. And then I feel like sometimes it's just like something I've noticed, where maybe one guy there was this one fire, and this really like changed my mindset of like, just, it's never going to be as big of a deal as you make in your mind. We were on a prescribed burn that was like pretty sporty conditions, means it was like pretty hot, and then we were getting a lot of spot fires. And basically you have a class to run a pump. And so they were like, hey, who wants to run the pump? And like, no one wants to, because it just makes a ton of noise. It's like super annoying. You're like in one spot, like wearing earplugs, just like doing it. And this one guy was like, well, I took the class, like I can do it. And I remember thinking in my mind, like, I've been in fire like 5 years and I've run a pump a lot. Like, I would never volunteer for that because the stakes are so high. And it just like really changed my mindset of like, oh, this one dude said he's taking the class, and everyone's like, sure, fine, be on the pump. And I was like, after that, I was like, and he did a great job, and he had some struggles, and like people came and helped him, and like it was not a big deal. And I just remember thinking, like, I put so much pressure on myself sometimes to do things like the way that I want them to be done, and like, no, like it has to be perfect, or it's like such like not worth doing. And so that was just like a really cool, like really freeing, and I'm just like really glad I got to have that mind shift of like, it's okay, like it'll be okay, and it's never as big of a deal as you make it seem. So that's another thing I preach to people, of just like, don't be scared to fail, because overall it's never going to be it's always going to be like not the same as you imagine it in your head. It's going to be fine. And then I like to just same thing, just tell people to not underestimate themselves, and it's really just trying to have confidence. And even if you have to fake it till you make it, like kind of cliche, that's okay. Like, you don't have to tell people exactly like what you're thinking, and just kind of like, just, I don't know, follow along and just find someone you can trust too. Cause I think sometimes it can be really scary, especially with fire. I'm sure similar with military, you're kind of like stationed somewhere, you go somewhere sometimes and you don't really know anyone. And that can be really hard mentally, to not feel like you have people already who are like in your corner that you can rely on, or have a community. And just, just trying to tell people like fire does become a family if you let it. Like you can get really close with the people you work with, and just part of that is just like being part of a team. And I just like really love that part of it. I don't feel like people do well in fire if they're really individualistic and aren't willing to kind of put the needs of the team before themselves. So just trying to remind people that like it is a team sport. Like you can't just go in as an individual and like expect to have a good time. It just doesn't work. So
Well,
those are
I gotta ask you before we let you go, because you alluded to this about, I think it was maybe your first uniform you got issued, you had to cut like 8 inches off the pants or something. So before you go, do you now have a uniform, Katrina, that fits you, that you do not have to hem 8 inches off the pant every season?
I do. So one of my engine captains, he was huge on hemming. So I had to actually cut them off and hem them nicely. I do so in my spare time as well. So I could do that. But he has since left. Sorry. We have relaxed standards now, and now we can just chop them. We call them pirate pants, and you can just have frayed edges. So I still like them a little shorter, but this is a funny story. So they make a size 24 to 28, like all the waist sizes are in like 4-inch sizes. And so our cash manager 2 years ago was like, hey, cash manager, I really want to order this size pants. Like, can you grab these out of the cash for me? Because that's pretty normal to go to a fire camp and have your, like most people have their size. And he wrote back and he said, they don't make 24 or 28s. Like those pants don't exist. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm like literally wearing a pair right now that I got from a previous florist. So I had to go in and show him the label on my pants to be like, these pants exist. Like they make these. They just don't have them at most normal caches. And so since then, he's been super rad because there's obviously other women my size like on the forest. And he orders like 10 pairs every year. So he makes sure that I have pants. So I don't know. It is funny that even people who have been in fire forever, like sometimes don't know all the sizes that are available. So yep, I have pants that fit me. I got my 24, 28.
That is fantastic. Well, okay. The obligatory, we mentioned your website, the 5footfirefighter.com, and we'll have that in the show notes. Where can people find you? Where can people find out more about your story and everything you're doing?
That's the primary way. I would say now that's fire season, I don't really update a lot of the blogs, but like the best place if you're not getting the answers you want on the main pages, the blogs, I do answer common questions that people have written me and trying to like get that information out there too. Absolutely always willing to take emails through the contact form. And then I'm on Instagram at KG Mohr, my last name, Mohr. And that's kind of where I just post like all the random stuff I do on fires and just kind of my daily life. And then I also have an Instagram at the 5-foot firefighter, but I don't really post that much on there just because I find it to be a big time suck. And honestly, I just kind of like, I tried for a while and it just like took over my life. So going back to the social media, it's just not my favorite.
I understand
Alex knows all about that.
It takes over. So I don't hang out really on Instagram that much, but that's where you can find more about me. And then, yeah, I guess podcasts every once in a while.
Outside online too. We'll include that one in the show notes too. And I want to say, first of all, fantastic guest, well deserving. This has been an awesome conversation. So thank you for coming on.
This was great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hey guys, this is Alex coming back with a quick addition to the episode here. Since we recorded with Katrina, she's been advocating really strongly for the Tim Hart Wildland Firefighter Classification and Parity Act. This bill would go a long way to helping these critical wildland firefighters make a living wage. They currently make as little as $13.45 an hour. They're GS3s for the most part, for those who know the federal system. And that does not include times when they're on standby or even times when they're on assignment but not actively at the fire site. Those periods they do not get paid. I'll be adding into the show notes a link to a website where you can learn more, as well as a fact sheet on the bill if you're interested in learning more and helping support it. Thanks.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.